Hello, everybody. Welcome in to the YouTube chats. Welcome in, everybody. Just give everyone a second to roll in. Give it a little bit of time. Welcome in. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Book Passage Live. We here at the bookstore, and now at home, are very excited to bring to you some of the best authors and conversations you can find out there on the internet. If you've seen one of these events before, well then welcome back. But if you're new here, Book Passage is an independently run bookstore out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and back when crowds weren't quite so dangerous to be in, we hosted events just like these at our stores. As we are now streaming on YouTube, and I think we'll continue to do so in the future, please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel by clicking the subscribe button just below the video. It doesn't cost you anything, and it honestly, truthfully does help us out a lot. Also, if you click the little bell right next to the subscribe button and click all from the drop-down menu, you'll be alerted every single time we go live, or even post a pre-recorded author interview, as we do from time to time. If you would like to check out tonight's book or anything else that's mentioned here tonight, you can find it all at bookpassage.com or from the link I'll post just a minute at the top of our YouTube chat. Finally, if you have any questions for tonight's speakers, please take the time to write them in the YouTube chat. I'll do my best to make sure that our speakers see them, and although we don't get to them all, every comment and question, every praise is always very, very appreciated. So thank you for being here. Now, on to tonight's guests. Eric Berkowitz is a writer, lawyer, and journalist. For more than 20 years, he's practiced intellectual property and business litigation laws in Los Angeles. He's published widely throughout his career, and his writing has appeared in periodicals like the New York Times, Washington Post, The Economist, LA Times, LA Weekly. His previous books include Sex and Punishment and The Boundaries of Desire. He comes to us today from our very own San Francisco. In conversation tonight, we have Judy Miller, an Emmy, DuPont, Columbia, Peabody Award-winning television correspondent and National Public Radio commentator. Working for ABC News in 1990, Miller has covered, among other stories, the 1992 Rodney King trial and ensuing riots, the 1994 Northridge earthquake, and the O.J. Simpson criminal and civil trials, for which she received an Emmy Award. We have some very, very excellent guests that we have here tonight. Thank you for coming out, everybody, one last time. Allow me to pass the show off to Eric and Judy. Welcome, everybody. Welcome.
Thanks a lot for that lovely introduction. It's Muller, but that's okay.
Muller. No, I'm sorry.
You can correct it at the end of the show.
Sure. We'll fix it in post.
Thank you. Absolutely. I'm really thrilled to be talking today with Eric Berkowitz. Eric is truly one of the finest writers I know, especially when it comes to tackling enormous subjects like, the history of censorship in the West. And I loved this book. Most authors would be intimidated, I think, by that huge subject matter, but Eric has this great talent of taking a big subject and serving it up in delicious little morsels of history. He's a great storyteller, and these are page-turning stories full of betrayal and heroism and sex, which is always helpful, and burning at the stake and all of those amazing dramatic things. One reviewer has called this book a masterpiece, astounding, a comprehensive, entertaining historical account of censorship. And that was not his mother, that was a real reviewer. So, okay. Don't do a spit take, Eric. Okay. Okay. One of the major takeaways for me, Eric, and I love this book, after reading it, it seems to me that a major theme is that censorship never really works, at least in the long run. Is that how you see it too? I mean, you've got all these examples, but in the end, all these attempts to censor thoughts and words in whatever form fail. Is that true?
I think it's almost entirely true, because there's a real difference between censoring a book or a picture or even shutting down a demonstration or even killing someone from the idea that actually is embodied in what is said. And what we find repeatedly in one form or another is that the efforts of authorities, either it's the mob or generally a government or the church, they're disturbed by an idea. They feel threatened by the idea, so they run down and try and eradicate all copies, et cetera, et cetera. But copies always survive, and even more than that, the idea in the copy survives. And so when something is suppressed, again, take it from your own life. When something is banned, you want to look at it. When something is buried, you want to dig it up. And oftentimes those who are suppressing are keeping copies for themselves. And so we see it repeatedly that when an expression is locked down, it squeaks its way through. Most recently, China has the most comprehensive internet scheme in the world. They do everything that they can with incredible millions of people, lots of money to bar foreign news. Well, the group Reporters Without Borders just found a way to funnel thousands of forbidden news stories through the online game Minecraft.
Which our children are playing. Yes.
People recorded stories in songs and put it in Spotify. It goes on. And so the examples are legion.
Well, I'm glad you brought up China, because that's China today, still struggling with how to keep dangerous ideas away from their people. But good
luck with that.
This book, right. This book begins with ancient China, some of the first emperors in China. What did they do to suppress ideas that they thought were dangerous?
Yeah, you actually touched on the opening anecdote of the book, which is what I thought sort of encompassed so many themes in the book. The first emperor of China was, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, excuse me, is Qin Shi Huang. And so we're now back in the 3rd century BC. And he is more of a warrior than just about anything else. Through a series of wars, he unifies China, starts to build the wall, unifies weights and measures, etc. And what he wanted was history to start with him. Okay, what infuriated him, he would go in costume and travel through the kingdom, and it killed him to hear people criticizing him. I mean, he was a great achiever, but he was hated, and particularly using Confucius and intellectuals saying this, we're in bad times now. It was really better then. These are the dark times. So what he did was he realized that Confucius was probably the source of all these ideas. So he gathered together not just Confucius, all books of poetry, literature, history, philosophy, burned them all, gathered them, well, not them all, he saved copies for himself. So again, censorship doesn't work. He also took the philosophers who were the leading Confucian philosophers who carried the ideas and buried them alive, buried 400 philosophers alive.
Whoa.
In fact, point forward, even to discuss the past critically using Confucius would get yourself killed along with your family. And so that worked for about 3 years.
Right.
That worked for about 3 years until he had some mental problems. He was consumed with forestalling death, and he died drinking an elixir of life. But the truth is, Confucian thought lasted. Chinese poetry and philosophy lasted. Qin didn't. In fact, he's the one who has the terracotta army. He was buried with that.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
That's him. It's that guy.
So you bring up a good subject, though, that he tried to keep it away from the masses. And this is another theme I see all the way through your book, is that censorship is kind of a class struggle. It's the haves versus the riffraff, people that they don't want to share stuff with. This goes from the church with pornography. I mean, what really blew this apart, right, was the printing press. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I can talk about that, and we can go into questions. You're doing this well because we're sort of building on things. One, censorship doesn't work. There's always the ideas. So then what do you do with it? If you're in the upper class and you're ruling things, what you're most concerned about is channeling knowledge, is channeling ideas rather than actually fully suppressing them. And so when books were just in written manuscripts, there was almost self-censorship. There weren't that many books to go around, and they were expensive and they were difficult. But the printing press blew that all apart. All of a sudden, what was in the exclusive province of the ruling classes became available to everybody. Well, instantly in 16th century time, that is in a few decades, the Catholic Church's index of forbidden books crept up, censorship laws crept up repeatedly, and the whole thing was to keep knowledge away from the masses, keep them ignorant, keep them docile, and that really has been a main preoccupation.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of what they call the Streisand effect. What I've heard of this, and you can explain what it comes from, but the idea that the more you try to suppress something, the more appealing it is.
Isn't that the case with you?
Oh, of course. You tell me you shouldn't read this, shouldn't look there, don't.
Banned in Boston, yeah.
Banned in Boston. Why is it named after Barbara Streisand, though? I mean, what does that come from?
I think that Barbara Streisand objected very much to having, there were some aerial pictures of her place in Malibu.
Yeah.
And she made a big stink trying to stop it. Everybody said, wait a minute, what is this place in Malibu? Let's have a look. All of a sudden, the views of it. So, yes, the forbidden fruit aspect of censorship never really stops. And so when, for example, England was very consumed in the 19th century with keeping criticism of the king down, keeping the masses from criticizing the king and the church in particular. So there's one example. There's this guy Hone, who was an antiquarian bookseller, who wrote some parodies, who wrote some jokes, sort of a book of humor, but really taking some hard bites at the ruling class and at the church. So what did the British government do? They put him on trial for seditious libel and blasphemy and everything else. No one had heard of this guy beforehand. He was just a guy. Well, the trial itself brought him fame. And before the trial, actually there were 3 trials. Before the trials were done, he was selling thousands and thousands of copies of his criticisms of the church. That's repeated in 100 different ways.
And what happened to him?
They finally gave up. He actually won the trials. Okay. And he didn't set out to be a warrior for free speech, but that's what he became.
And I'm thinking about the story of Tyndale.
Perfect. Yes.
Also, talk a little bit about him, because he didn't win in the sense that he lost his life, but in the
this
long
is a great
run,
story. Yeah.
What he was trying to do became a fact. So it was a case of actually a boomerang effect. Talk about him a little bit.
Yeah. In fact, let's start with Tyndale being now termed by the British Library as the most important writer in the English language next to Shakespeare.
And give us a date.
What? Yeah, Tyndale lived in the early 16th century, and he was a scholar, again, obscure, a professor at Oxford and Cambridge, and he read Martin Luther's illegal translation of the Bible. There was a big battle back then with the church trying to, again, class questions, hold on to their hold on the Bible, keep it in Latin, keep people from reading it in their own languages. Well, Tyndale thought, I'm going to translate this into English. He went to the Bishop of London, said, can I do this? And the bishop said, of course not. We'll kill you if you do that. He went to the continent, did a brilliant job of it, and began to smuggle it into England. Thousands and thousands of copies began to get sold, again, because they were forbidden. And so the bishop was chasing all the illegal copies. He resorted to actually having his agents buy copies of the illegal Bible from Tyndale himself in order to bring them back to England, because Tyndale was in Holland at that point, and burn them. And so Tyndale was finally caught and murdered. Now, what's the epilogue to this? His illegal Bible was so brilliant that times changed very, very soon. Henry VIII broke with the church, and Tyndale's version of the Bible became the core of the King James Bible.
Right.
So this ultra forbidden document became mainstream, and it's now said in
bestseller.
a bestseller,
Today.
and also lasting for 5 or 6 centuries because it's still part of the core Bible.
Yeah. So there is this boomerang effect, and sometimes I think we don't know the full story. I'm thinking of Salman Rushdie here, and I think if you ask most people, they say, yes, I remember he wrote a book that offended Islamic mullahs who put out a fatwa on him, which is, kill him if you see him. And he had to go into hiding in England. And that looked bad. But now, Salman Rushdie, I mean, he was up here in the mountains where I live not long ago having dinner, a year ago. And I saw him near me, and the first thought was, ooh, fatwa, should I move? Anyway, no. but to most people, it looks as though Salman Rushdie came out just fine. He's still writing and all of that. But isn't there a kind of lingering effect of something like that? A kind of censorship that's latent, that's underneath, that people start watching themselves on whether they're going to publish him? Or, is there a lingering effect that censorship like that has on an author or is reading public?
It certainly does. And there's an accumulated effect of it. And it's sort of a step-by-step process. There's a writer who I want to give a shout out to, Kenan Malik in England, who has spent a lot of time on this. And he used a wonderful phrase, which I wish I could claim. It's called, we've internalized the fatwa. Okay, just for our readers, Salman Rushdie produced a book called The Satanic Verses. It was offensive to some in Islam, and there was this death sentence, a fatwa put on him. The British government had a lot of pressure to shut him down, as did his publisher, and they both stood by him. Okay, and so his book was never fully censored. He survived, but we've internalized the fatwa now in the sense that we're much more concerned with offense. And Malik, covered a lot of plays that weren't produced, art exhibits that weren't staged, concerts that weren't put on because of our fear that perhaps there will be an offense, not necessarily violence, but we've internalized this notion, and we could talk about this if you want.
Yeah. That
free speech is fine so long as it doesn't bother anybody, so long as it doesn't offend anybody. And that's not the free speech that we really care about. It's the Larry Flints, it's the Salman Rushdies, it's the screamers, it's the nutcase down the street who is protecting your speech, not you and me. Okay, we just live our lives, and so we've come to believe, or at least many have come to believe, that free speech itself is a risk. It's a source of harm rather than the reward of a free society. And I think that the lesson of the lingering, let's call it pulling punches from Satanic Verses and then the Danish cartoons, is that in a diverse society, offense is no longer the price that we pay for freedom. Offense is something to be policed and shut down. And I personally believe that is really incompatible with the real notions of what free speech is.
Well, since we're on this, have you ever personally self-censored or felt a need to?
Well, yes. In fact, I think I know where you're going. I have self-censored on this book itself, right, in a very painful way. You taught me when you were my journalism professor that the reporter should never be the story, that the writer isn't the story. But in this case, I was writing about this book is being published in the United States and in the UK. And my UK publisher is run by an extremely brave woman who was goading me to for the whole time, don't pull punches, tell the truth, be bold. Okay. And I was writing about Malik, and I was writing about this whole issue that you and I were just talking about. And there was a recent decision by the European Court of Human Rights, which I criticized very, very heavily. And I'll just give you a quick background on that. This woman had given a seminar in Austria in which she called the Prophet Muhammad a pedophile because he had a young wife, a very young wife. And he was prosecuted in this environment for inciting hatred. And the European Court of Human Rights upheld that and saying, well, the rules of discourse say that you shouldn't be gratuitously offensive, etc. And I was just astounded that the highest court protecting human rights in Europe, protecting free expression, said free expression unless you offend people. And I said something to the effect of, this is horrible that now that we've internalized the fatwa for all of Europe. Well, my publisher, this very, very bold woman, called me and said, Eric, I can't do it.
Really?
Can't do it. I cannot write that line. I cannot say that we've internalized the fatwa. We've had death threats. We've had bricks through the window. I've got a child. My employees have children. You got to rewrite it. For a minute, I thought, I'm going to pull the book. I'm not doing this. I mean, I'm a hypocrite. And then I realized from my very safe, hyper-privileged perch in San Francisco, where no one's threatening me for anything, it's very easy to be a First Amendment absolutist. And then I self-censored. And then I wrote around it. Now, for those who want to read the American edition, it's all there. But the UK edition, for the safety of others, has been amended to that small extent.
And yet, here in Afghanistan, just last week, 50 young girls were killed at a school. Clearly an attempt to stop the education of young women under a very extreme Islamic law kind of idea. And that obviously is going to have an effect in the same way that it had an effect on you when somebody said, I'd be in danger if you write this. I mean, all of it is it's not even subtle, but it does have a censoring effect, correct? I mean,
it does.
It does. All over the world.
The difference between Afghanistan, Afghanistan is a much less diverse society than the one that we're living in. I think that what we're paying the price on, I'm not sure it's right. I'm not defending this. And I'm not defending offense either. I mean, I'm easily offended. I've got my soft spots, and when I hear things that hit my soft spots, I feel pain. That doesn't mean I want to necessarily shut it down, but to acknowledge that a lot of speech causes pain is not to say that it should be barred. But we're in a diverse society now in universities, which were set up basically for white men. It's a lot different now. And a lot of people are saying that, the price of a diverse society is we have to be a little bit more careful. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's what it comes down to. What happened in Afghanistan is hideous by any perspective.
Yes, I want to get to academia in a minute. And,
of course, I was just touching on
anything else, but I think that most Americans, if asked, would say, yes, we believe in free speech. We are proud of the First Amendment. And yet there are signs that they'd like to tinker with the First Amendment a little bit. I mean, it's maybe gone too far for some people. Is there any evidence that Americans are torn on this issue, a little schizoid on this issue?
Oh my God, we're not a little schizoid. We're cut into pieces. I mean, we're in fragments around the floor. We're very proud of our traditions. We're very proud of our free speech, but at the same time, surveys are showing that at least half Americans and more millennials believe that the First Amendment is outdated.
Really?
And yeah, I've cited a few polls, and it's getting more and more. In fact, there's this group the Fire, which tracks free speech on campuses, which tracked a lot of Ivy League students who thought that you could forcibly shut people down if they're speaking what you don't want. we're touchy. We're becoming increasingly touchier. We can't bear the idea of an idea that doesn't fit ours, and we want it stopped. And so it's really, really interesting. In my opinion, one of the signature achievements of this country is the last 50, 60 odd years, which is the freest free speech environment the world has ever known by a large margin, okay? We have a Supreme Court that said, you know, the noise of free speech is powerful medicine for a society. It makes us responsible for ourselves. It makes us responsible for taking care of a free society. But now, I think a lot of people are turning to the government and saying, censor us, protect me, stop that person, stop that person from saying things. And when you ask whether we're torn, that is absolutely part of it. And we're looking to, you know, social media, you know, allow me to say what I want, but stop him. Stop
exactly.
her.
Exactly.
I can't stand it. Yeah.
And social media, Facebook, Twitter, et al., have been they've almost weaponized the kind of hate speech and propaganda and lies that used to be censored. I mean, and there are those who say that Facebook, excuse me, has become the biggest censor now in our country. I mean, how do you feel about how that is all falling out with their oversight council banning Trump for another 6 months because of his insightful speech? Nobody's lied more on Facebook and Twitter than the former president. But yet you know, as somebody who's written about censorship, you must be horrified at the idea that we would be censoring any kind of speech as a country. Now, Facebook's a private company, and they are allowed to do that. I mean, but give me your thoughts on that whole issue.
Do you remember that Disney cartoon from when we were kids? There's called The Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think what, you know, where you start something and it looks good, and then you actually be careful what you wish for. Right? That's the subtitle of what I talk about with respect to the internet. Yeah, just a little bit of background. The way that this was set up, the way that our country was set up, is that the government, at least at this point, has almost no power to censor speech, unless it's a direct incitement to violence, unless it's, you know, copyright infringement, you know, very, very, very limited exceptions. Whereas the private sector, we normally think about restaurants, you know, cafes, schools, things like that, has almost complete power to censor speech. You know, don't tread on me, okay? And so because the normal model of censorship has been people versus the government. Well, we have a sorcerer's apprentice where this private world has been expanded to encompass the world. Facebook, Twitter, the others are private companies. So they don't have to censor anything. And they can censor everything if they want. So in this country, hate speech, offense, things like that, they're legal. The government has no power. So what we want, as people are increasingly, and I think in many ways rightfully, made crazy by what's going on social media, particularly when you have a president himself and his minions shoving the hatred and the lies into the system. And it's not just on Facebook, I mean, it's on TV, print, et cetera. Is we want the social media companies to sort of do the dirty work that the government can't. And it's all, you know, there's no one happier about this. He might look concerned when he shows up in the Senate every few weeks to get knocked around by senators. There's no one happier about this chaos than Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, because every dispute makes them money. Okay, they've set up the system to foster conflict because that keeps us on the platform and keeps us targeted for ads. And so effectively, the censorship was set up on this pure First Amendment principle But then as Facebook went into Europe and the other world, and they had to absorb the much more restrictive rules of Europe, we've re-imported hate speech laws back into this country. And I think, we can badger Facebook all we want, but they're going to do what they want. And their Facebook, and that board of theirs is just a whitewash. It's just basically saying, look, something bright, look over there, we're taking care of it, stay away from us.
Okay. I want to remind those of you who are listening and tuning in that you can ask questions, put them up on the chat board. And if we have time, and we're going to try to make time, we will be sure to ask Eric your questions. So just put it on the chat and I'll keep an eye on it. So while we're on social media, do you see a role? Do you see any kind of push for government regulation of the internet, social media companies? Does that scare you?
Yes, it scares me terribly. And that's not to say that I'm not made crazy by a lot of the terrible things that I see on the net. There's two words that arise when I think about government regulation of the internet, and that's Donald Trump. Just think about, it was the First Amendment that effectively saved us from him. He was an absolute enemy of speech and absolutely ready to jail anybody who spoke against him. And he called the press the enemy of the people, 5,000 times. It wasn't hyperbole. He actually believed that. So as we talk about government regulation and as we call to the government for censorship, and this is one of the lessons of my book, reaching back 3,000 years, is you always have to look at who's doing the regulation. So if we think that government can regulate hate speech or fake news or these other terrible things to benefit us, we always have to think, but what if Donald Trump had that power? What if Jeff Sessions had that power? What if Josh Hawley had that power, et cetera? So whereas I, as much as anyone, want the crud, the dirt, filth, the horror off the internet, I'm very concerned about the solution being far worse than the problem.
There are people who talk a lot about cancel culture, political correctness, and this is a reaction to a movement that's understandably worried about hate speech. We see white supremacists. Yeah, it's all together. But what do you think of that term, cancel culture and political correctness, and the impact it's having, for instance, in academia?
The latest example of cancel culture that I've seen came out yesterday out of the Kentucky Derby. That horse, what's the horse's name? Medina Spirit, flunked the drug test.
Yeah.
Well, the owner of that horse is pretty mad. So he said, cancel culture. You're canceling out my horse. I've got the tweet right in front of me here.
What does that have to do with what?
Nothing. Cancel culture is one of these terms like politically correct or woke. There are these terms that we use that are bleached of all meaning. Even the word unconstitutional. Well, that's unconstitutional. We use these terms to label things and developments that we don't like. Okay, so cancel culture. Yes.
Yeah. On the other hand, there's a very renewed concern about the N-word, about words that offend people, transgender attacks, and that kind of thing. But I've also seen such an overreaction in academia, professors being fired. For instance, a Rutgers professor recently, during a Zoom meeting with a couple of students, one student asked to read a case study. Read it. It was a law student. And in reading the case study, the N-word was printed, and he read it, reading from the case study. And this created it got leaked in a huge thing. And both the professor and the student have apologized. And it sounds like something out of Mao's Cultural Revolution, where they're ordered to apologize or else. And he was reading and quoting. Certain words now have become
radioactive.
Pardon me?
Radioactive.
Radioactive. And they are words. Isn't intention important? What kind of intention do you say something with? For instance, take the word bitch. If you say it in anger against a woman, that's sexist and awful and misanthropic. But if you say, it's a female dog, it's also what a bitch, it's just an expression. And there's a town in France called Bitche, Bitche, which, as you know, had to remove its name from Facebook because Facebook was upset that the word bitch was in their title on their Facebook page. Doesn't intention have some power here? That we lost our minds is what I'm asking, Eric.
Yeah, we have lost our minds. Facebook is facing in Europe massive fines, gargantuan fines for letting hate speech through. Billions and billions and billions of pieces of content roll through Facebook every hour. Their human content moderators that they hire just filed a class action suit because they're made insane because the working conditions are so terrible. So what Facebook uses, in addition to the human content moderators, are programs. And the programs do clean sweeps for offensive. So no human thought, I'm going to off the town of Bitche, France. Well, they just saw the term and it was gone. And so the town actually renamed itself so it could enter the world. But on intent, so there is a lack of intention on the social media platforms trying to keep up with regulations, and they over-remove. That's a real problem. But they're also talking about cancel culture, and you were talking about the N-word. Yes, that word, like the swastika, like a number of other things, are simply radioactive. Okay, the swastika is allowed here in Germany. No, it'll get cleaned. It'll get cleaned out. It won't happen. They have force beyond what they signify. And now that case that you were talking about, that was a law school, the N-word case. That was in a law school, and there was a student who was actually quoting from a judge's opinion that included that word. So her intention in quoting that was simply to discuss the case. But we've hit a point of touchiness where that can't be allowed. I think talking about cancel culture, I want to get a little bit more subtle than that because I was making fun of it with respect to the horse. A lot of people view cancel culture as sort of the revenge of the powerless, that those who don't have power can get together and call out or make someone accountable for doing something hideous or having done something hideous or saying something wrong. And this is a way for people to use social media and to gather the power and bring people down when the power structures won't. That sounds good in theory, but what emerges is mostly the good old-fashioned mob. And there's a lot of subtlety that's gone, and there's a lot of lives ruined. Maybe some lives should be ruined, but a lot more are not. And yes, professors are getting cleaned out, students are getting expelled and their acceptances revoked because I think administrations are simply terrified of the mob, of getting canceled.
But it is censorship by mob, is it not? In a sense, by political correctness. I'm just making this argument because so many people do. I'm not saying that's my opinion. It really is as though you can't escape censorship on one way, in some way or another. At the university,
censorship used to mean exclusively actions by the government against people. That's how I understand. That's what censorship typically means. There's a judge or a cop or something else. In this case, I guess the better word, since censorship is losing a lot of its real meaning, is maybe silencing.
Okay, I've got a question on the chat that I want to get in before I don't want to get away from social media right away. And the question is, do you have an opinion on whether Section 230 of the Communication Act needs to be modified or eliminated? And first explain what Section 230 is.
Yeah, sure. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Section 230 is this obscure statute that is no longer obscure. What it does, it's been called the 26 words that made the internet. What it basically says is that the platforms, everything from Facebook to AllTrails and to Yelp and to Wikipedia, anything that involves user-generated content, comments, contributions, the platforms themselves, the people that host, they're not liable for anything said. They're just letting it happen. Now, if it was typically the old world with newspapers, that wasn't always the case by any stretch, but it basically allowed interactive internet communications to happen, and it blew up. You know, the statute was passed in '96, and here we are 5 years later, et cetera. And Section 230 has taken a lot of heat for being blamed for, you know, all the crud on the internet and the pervasiveness of hatred. On some level, yes. On some level, no. In answer to this, to the question, should it be modified? I guess my feeling would be no, a qualified no. And here's why. It can't be really modified very well, because if the government starts to tinker with what the platforms can do with respect to speech, there's going to be First Amendment problems. We still have a very strong First Amendment, like it or not. And companies such as Facebook have speech rights. And if they want to amplify something, if they want to not amplify something, that's their right to do it. There's a lot that can be done to clean up the internet. We can talk about that at some length. You know, maybe now's not the time. I personally think, briefly, that we should get them where they breathe and stop the targeted advertising model that is this giant, you know, not you, but women have, or people have weight loss apps or spiritual.
That's me.
They confess their things into their phone that all finds its way to Facebook.
Oh yeah.
Facebook knows you're pregnant before you are, before you do, and they target ads to it. So the targeted ad model, the model that follows someone around and targets ads to them, is really, I think, in many ways the culprit, because to keep you targeted with ads, they're going to keep you agitated and keep you on platform a long time. I think we can monkey with ads much more safely under the First Amendment than we would get after 5 years of litigation telling Facebook and the others, allow this, don't allow that, do this, don't do that. That's going to lose in court.
Yeah. I think you're right. It's all about the money. It's all about clickbait. It's all about appealing to our worst selves. Whenever I get somebody liking my opinion, of course, that goes to an endorphin in my brain that says, "Oh, they like me." And so,
or when you hear that your enemy is worse than you ever thought,
right.
You know. I mean, I actually asked my publisher, "How did you target my book on social media?" I was curious, and they told me, "Oh, the precise personality characteristics. This is for my, you know, stupid book, you know."
That's really funny.
So no one out of my mental set, or someone who might agree with me, is going to see an ad for this book.
So nobody who marched in Charlottesville with the white supremacist groups is probably going to buy your book. Is that what you're saying?
They're not going to ever know that it exists. And that's a terrible thing, because I would love that they would. Because
you make some very good, you have a great story about that. One of the fellows who was marching with the white supremacists in Charlottesville, he's allowed to say whatever he wants, right? That's free speech. And then what happened to it?
He was more than allowed to say what he wants. He was protected by police as saying what he wants. He was protected for carrying that stupid tiki torch and screaming those ridiculous, hideous things. You know, this lowlife was absolutely protected as much as you or I are. Then he goes back to the Berkeley hot dog restaurant where he works, and the door's shut. He doesn't have a job anymore.
Oh, there you go.
Which perfectly illustrates the public-private thing that we have. Now, I want to add one more thing. All right, so he goes back to the Free Speech Center of the Universe,
right.
Berkeley,
right.
Finds that his free speech isn't so respected there. The owner of it's called Top Dog. The owner of the hot dog place said, "We respect our employees' rights. They're free to make their own choices, but they must accept the responsibilities." That is, no more job. That same week, These two hapless Chinese tourists go to Berlin. They're standing in front of the Reichstag in Berlin, and they raise a Nazi salute. Within 10 seconds, they're arrested. So this really perfectly illustrates how various countries and private entities, you can't do that in Germany, even if you're a tourist. So, yeah.
Almost every day, we are hearing examples, and these stories are everywhere. And censorship doesn't have to be about books. It doesn't have to be about movies. There were two young Black kids who were sent home from school. Trying to remember the state even. Somewhere in the Midwest.
I think it was Oklahoma.
Oklahoma. Because they were wearing Black Lives Matter T-shirts. And the school said, oh, this is outrageous. They can't wear this sort of propaganda. And the mother said, but what these boys are saying, I think they were like 7 and 9 or something, very young, is that my life matters. What is so offensive about that, And that's one example. Then we've got book publishers saying, well, we don't want to rewrite history. We don't want to include any of that ugly stuff. We don't want to teach the 1619 project that the New York Times has about Black history in this country because it revises what we thought we knew. I mean, what do you think of that? That's censorship, is it not? The telling people what they can wear, telling people they can't read that. It's the same old thing.
Absolutely. I was, and in fact, you and I chatted about this a couple of days ago. I mean, it was extremely sad to me. That's the only word. Yeah. To tell a 5-year-old kid that he can't wear a T-shirt saying that his own life matters. That's an over-aggressive school board. That's a school board that is responding to pressure that equates Black Lives Matter with terrorism, et cetera, that is scared of African-American identity, I suppose. Hideous. The 1619 project is more than telling people that they can't read. There's now legislation in a number of states saying you can't teach this. You can't teach. For our viewers, the 1619 project was this massive, magnificent piece of research and presentation done by the New York Times talking about how fundamental slavery is to the fabric of this country and how it persists. Well, there's now, bills in a number of states forbidding, hoping to forbid the teaching of that project in school. That they'll lose on First Amendment grounds. I mean, that will happen. But what it means is, well, it follows a long tradition. Every regime seeks to rewrite history in order to bolster itself. That's in democratic societies and as well as authoritarian ones. And we're just seeing the latest manifestation of it.
We do have a question from somebody who's watching. Karen Foley asks, do you have any suggestions for what citizens can do on the topic of fighting censorship? I mean, what do we do? How do we, as individual citizens in this country, which purports to respect free speech, do we speak up when we see a kid sent home from school? Is it down to that point of view? To that small of a place? Is it about refusing to be on Facebook if they continue to use algorithms to track our marketing desires?
This isn't going to be a very good answer, and I've really held back in the book and in appearances from trying to fashion myself some kind of judge and jury and prescriptor for how society can arrange itself. Society is chaotic and we're full of a lot of conflict, and it didn't start with Facebook. Okay, we went into a war in Iraq based on a fundamental lie that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11, amplified by the New York Times. There were decades and decades and decades where we thought that, or it was taught that African Americans have a different skull shape and that makes them inferior. These dark things have been living with us for a long, long time. To respond to this question, you got to do things that scare you, okay? And you got to put yourself in harm's way just a little bit. That when there's a professor in your school who you don't agree with, okay, whose views you find abhorrent, is getting canceled or is getting fired or is getting put under review for something he or she said, you've got to speak out in favor of that person. You have to argue against your own interest, because I really, really deeply believe this, that without a robust free speech environment in which we hurt, in which our brain rings, in which we get a little bit dizzy, we're not going to expose the lies that we need to fight. I honestly, every day I would wake up and think, what fresh hell is Trump giving me? And I would read his tweets and I would think, oh, get this guy off. And I'm so pleased that he's off. But I also know that him fulminating like he did on Twitter exposed what a maniac he was, and I think was a great reason why we got rid of him.
I love the phrase, you have to work against your own interests, because I can remember when the Nazis marched through Skokie years ago. When was that? 60s. And the ACLU, you're a lawyer, the ACLU backed their right to do that. They were carrying Nazi flags that were
took a lot of grief for that.
I know they did.
I mean, a lot. You know what?
I thought, wow, that's true to your principles. That's true to free speech. And you're a lawyer. What would you have done?
Think of Thurgood Marshall, the head of the NAACP, voted with the majority to protect the rights of a Ku Klux Klanman, calling for his own murder, calling for the murder of African Americans. Marshall was able to see, I hate this. This scares me. But I'm not going to take the role of shutting down another person's speech. So what can we do? Absolutely, we speak out against silencing. Absolutely, we speak out against things, but not to echo what we already believe. To do what sometimes feels, if it doesn't hurt, it doesn't count. Let's put it like that.
I think the First Amendment is so misunderstood, and the hardest thing. It's one thing to say, yes, I have a right to speak. It's another thing to say, you have a right to speak, even though I hate what you're saying. And when the founding fathers put the First Amendment in the Constitution, it wasn't a snap deal. It wasn't the first thing they thought of, was it? It was, and also it wasn't entirely free speech at the time.
I mean, Ben Franklin, of all people, said that when they passed the First Amendment, no one had any real idea what the hell they were doing. I forgot how he put it, but he put it beautifully. There was no debate about the First Amendment during the Constitutional Convention. It was, someone brought it up. They said, forget it. The idea of what free speech was in the late 18th century when they passed it, the idea of what free speech is now is extremely different. Now, I'm not saying that what we call the absolutist view of the First Amendment that we have now, that has emerged in the last 50 years, is it. I don't want to freeze history, but we also have to, appreciate our achievements. The founding fathers, 7 years after the First Amendment was passed, we passed a Sedition Act which outlawed almost all dissent. And no one, so the free speech, the First Amendment has evolved. It was passed as a sort of an intention, and it's taken shape. I'm just really worried that in the fact that we are living in a highly partisan environment, and people are hurting. And I acknowledge that. I am as well. That we don't take that as an excuse to simply say, "Oh, F it. Let's just rewrite the whole thing." We should move a little bit more slowly and carefully.
I noticed you said "F it."
Oh yeah, I'm scared about
here. Okay, no, it's fine. That's just a joke. We do have a really good question, and we do have time to ask it, from Lou Judson, who says, "Do you have an opinion about Mark Twain and the N-word, as in Huckleberry Finn? A publisher did not want to use the word in print, but it's historical and represents the time in which he lived. Without it, it is not the same book, I believe." This really encapsulates the free speech, censorship, time moves on, historical perspective, what was the intention? It's all there in that particular thing. And all across the country, people boards of education are banning Huckleberry Finn from the schools. It's a classic. What do you think?
Well, I think that, as we were saying, that word, a word born of hatred, a word born of everything wrong, is radioactive.
I should point out to people who may not have read Huckleberry Finn that the character of Jim, the N word is used in front of his name all the time because that was the styles of the speech at the time. Okay.
Yeah. So if we went through Huckleberry Finn, and that word is probably used 1,600 times in that book, and let's just say we took a Sharpie to it, one that would only call further attention to the existence of that word. When you erase something, you simply highlight it. So this gets back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. If we said Jim, it would only make the word that much more loud in our heads. So the idea isn't going away. You could erase the page, but the idea is there. To get to what Mr. Johnson said, yes, I agree with you entirely. That book not only is a great literary achievement, it's a great example of a mindset during that time. I think Twain was very actively using that word to the extent that he was to highlight the injustices, and he was not using it in a way to call for violence or call for hatred. Your comment, Judy, about intention matters a lot here. In short, you can take a Sharpie to the word, but the word is still there, and we need to deal with the hatred behind the word, not the word itself.
Right. I think that's really the important place to sort of wrap this up. And that was a great question in which to do it. This is obviously a debate that's going to rage on for centuries because, as you've shown, it never goes away. People try to censor and it never works. And here we go round and round. And now we've got social media, which has just weaponized the whole debate. And we shall see. We shall see. Time will tell. All of those platitudes. So I see that Nick has rejoined us. I want to thank you, Eric, my dear friend, for writing this book. It is wonderful. I cannot emphasize how many stories we weren't able to get to, but they're there and they're wonderful. And it just reminds you that history is full of heroes who stood up against real oppression to keep freedom of speech going. And that for me is the great takeaway. So
and some really great villains as well.
Can't forget them. Good. Henry VIII stands out.
Henry VIII, yeah.
The guy who buried people alive stands out. But anyway, really good stories. And thank you for writing it. And thank you for being with us today. Nick?
Absolutely. Everybody, the book is Dangerous Ideas, and our author tonight was Eric Berkowitz. Thank you again, Judy, for being in conversation tonight. It was a really, really lovely conversation. We had some excellent questions in chat. Thank you to everybody that showed up. There was an interesting discussion as well that happened in there. That was very, very entertaining. Thank you very much. I was glad to be a part of it. If you'd like to purchase the book, you can do so from bookpassage.com. The link has been posted multiple times in the chat. You can go and follow it there. If you happen to live near our store, you can pick it up from us if you like. But even if you don't live near us, we'll ship it anywhere in the United States directly to your doorstep, if that's what you'd like to do. In addition to that, if you have a local bookstore, we really, really will not begrudge you if you purchase from them. We love all indies all across the country, not just us, although if you do want to purchase from us, we'd be very happy to help. Again, if you enjoyed the conversation tonight, please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. It's completely free and helps us out a ton. If you enjoyed the conversation a little bit more, then you can click that thumbs up button. It helps the glorious YouTube algorithm recommend our videos just a little bit faster to everybody else. Thank you again one last time for showing up. Dangerous Ideas. Thanks again to Eric and Judy. I had a great time. Let's go ahead and wave goodbye to everybody. Thank you for coming. We'll see you all again, I hope, very soon.